Kia ora, and welcome to the RAS New Zealand Symposium. My name is Anne Hood, and I am CEO of Refugees as Survivors. Today, our topic is political perspectives, and I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, Helen Clark and Golriz Ghahraman. Helen will be very well known to all of you as Prime Minister of New Zealand, Administrator of the UN Development Programme, and patron of the Helen Clark Foundation. Most recently, she has been appointed by the WHO to co-chair a review of its handling of the pandemic and government responses. She is also patron of RAS New Zealand. Golriz is an international human rights lawyer, a member of Parliament for the Green Party, and most recently, an author. Two things make her an expert for today's topic. Golriz came to New Zealand as an asylum seeker with her family from Iran at the age of 9, and she is the first refugee to be elected to the New Zealand Parliament. She knows firsthand how it feels to escape oppression and persecution and the impact of hate speech based on xenophobia and racism. Thank you both so much for supporting RAS New Zealand and being with me today. We'll begin our conversation for the first 40 to 45 minutes and end with a Q&A. Audiences, welcome. You are welcome to add your questions to the Q&A tab on the screen as we go. Just letting Helen get settled in, and we're
settled.
Go. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
So Helen, I'm going to direct the first question to you. There are currently over 79 million displaced people worldwide. 26 million of them are refugees. And in the last year, only 107,000 have been resettled. Every day, 37 new people are displaced. So how can we hope to solve this crisis when so few people seeking refuge can be resettled?
Well, these crises will only be settled if you can settle the fundamental driver of what caused the forced displacement. And the fundamental drivers are often conflict and repression and or human rights abuses. Often in the mix of contributing factors is a degree of exclusion, of poor governance, of corruption, of resources not getting to where they should. In other words, you've got a heady mix of issues which lead to circumstances where people are forced to flee from their homes. And as you say, the terrifying figure now of 79 million plus people, that's a significant little proportion of the total of humanity. So clearly we're not going to effectively address the crisis by resettling just over 107,000 people a year. We have to have much more effort going into stopping these situations arising. Now, having said that, how do you change the nature of the Syrian regime? How do you change the nature of the conflict in Yemen? But behind each of these profound and desperate conflicts which are displacing people are often proxy wars, major powers, regional powers who fuel conflicts and keep them going. And until there's some level of responsibility by those who foster and nurture these conflicts at great cost to human life, health and well-being, we're not going to make a lot of progress. So my plea is, for New Zealand diplomacy and other diplomacy to keep putting the heat on to stop the fighting, stop the bloodshed. And when you stop that, you can start to see displacement numbers come down. But sadly, the trajectory has been upwards for a number of years now. Indeed.
Golriz, have you got anything to add to that?
I'm really glad that we've begun by talking about the causes of the displacement. because absolutely that's what we have to resolve, and that's kind of the source of the, really oddly and heartbreakingly, that seems to be the source of prejudice against us as refugees, that we've come from these violent, repressive places, but actually, you know, we're sort of the victims of it. And you know, I was really happy to have our administration pull out of the Middle Eastern wars. We did still have some military deployment there that the last government had put in place, and it's small, but it's that recognition that we were contributing to the militarization rather than the solutions and the building of pathways to peace and, you know, actual development. So we have pulled that, but New Zealand does have a lot more to do as well, because we do still, and you know, we had a minister for defence, a New Zealand First Minister for Defence, who did spend billions on war-making sort of vessels and technology over the past few years that would have been best spent elsewhere, and also, you know, for New Zealand to have kind of staked our claim again as an independent voice on the world stage and kind of contribute to mediating peace.
So along those lines, similar statistics in a way, 85% of displaced people are hosted in developing countries. Many people seek refuge in countries which have not signed up to the Refugee Convention. They do not have rights to education, to housing, to employment, and many are detained in prison indefinitely. So I was wondering what you think about whether the UN Migration Compact has got a role to play in addressing these seemingly intolerable situations.
Well, let's remember that we had two important compacts signed at the end of 2018, as I recall. One was the migration one, which got a lot of quite ridiculous political flack, including in our own country. And the other one was a refugee compact. The migration one did break some new ground. And my experience, Anne, at UNDP was that member states were actually not that keen to be bound by obligations on migration. Look, for example, how difficult it is.
Well, Helen's frozen slightly, so we might just, oh, here we are, you're back again. You're back,
back again. Sorry, maybe I should start again from where I was. It's been difficult to get member state engagement with migration issues. And so the migration framework from late 2018 was a breakthrough. Also a breakthrough in that it had some recognition of climate change as an issue, which gives entry points for future advocacy, particularly by civil society in that area, because we know climate change is going to drive migration, forced migration, where people can't live where they were previously. But the Migration Compact provides a framework within which countries need then to design their policies. So if countries, including ours, would take that seriously, then it could be helpful. But it runs the risk, I think, of being a document that gathers dust on bookshelves unless it's actually given life. And that's where the role of civil society will be so critical, of advocates, of those who want to see countries develop proper frameworks around migration policy.
Golriz, how do you see New Zealand's role here? Because you've been in government during this time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just want to reiterate how shameful it was that the UN Migration Compact was sort of co-opted and used quite dishonestly to sort of garner anti-migrant sentiments for I imagine pretty low level political gain. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It was led by Jerry Brownlee, and he has a lot to answer for that here, because of course, while that compact wasn't binding, and I totally agree, it has a potential, but it also has a potential to gather dust. It was used as a tool to sort of drive prejudice that does harm our actual communities out there on the street. feel it here in New Zealand too. But I think what was really exciting about it was that kind of, well, exciting might be overshooting it, but was positive was that recognition that the migration journey, you know, has a human rights framework attaching to it, that migrants don't lose their human rights and their right to be safe, their, you know, their sort of legal standing as people with those rights throughout the migration journey. And that we're going to commit to working together to kind of ensure those rights and their safety. And it is a really violent process in some cases, as you say, because, you know, you are likely to cross a border into somewhere where you don't have any rights as an asylum seeker, for example. And we've seen what happens on the border of the United States. So at least if we could cooperate in a way where those nations who are not parties to other more binding UN conventions or international law can at least come together to kind of work on something more practical for the rights of migrants and refugees, then it is positive.
So coming to the current situation, the COVID pandemic is having a devastating impact on refugee communities right around the world. So what response should we expect from UN, from international agencies, and from countries like New Zealand? So thinking outside New Zealand for now, what about refugees around the world?
Well, straight out cash is what is needed. You know, we have these huge populations in camps. In Cox's Bazar, which I understand is probably the biggest camp in the world now for the Rohingya people from Myanmar, 855,000 refugees. The first cases cropped up there in July. I think we're probably all familiar from our television screens at how desperate the conditions are in Cox's Bazar. At really ideal conditions for infectious disease to spread. The agencies who are working with the refugees there struggle at the best of times to provide the routine health services. And so if COVID-19 sweeps through, then the routine services are destabilized, as well as there not really being the equipment and resources to deal with those who get seriously ill from COVID-19. Now, let me make a point here, which comes from my being the chair of the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, headquartered at WHO and has 1,000 member organizations. What we see around the world is that with COVID-19, with lockdowns, with governments literally running out of money, a lot of the routine health services suffer. And that means that children don't get their vaccinations. It means that women don't get their contraception. You have more unwanted pregnancies. You have more unsafe abortions. You have more unattended childbirths. You'll have more babies dying at birth, mothers dying in childbirth. You have more people not getting their antiretrovirals or the other drugs that they need. So COVID-19 becomes a health crisis that goes beyond the crisis of those who are very seriously impacted by the disease itself to all these spillover effects. Now, what I would say, coming to your specific point of how do we help the refugees in the camps, we have to support the agencies that are in there trying to make a difference. So, for example, the World Health Organization, the UN High Commission for Refugees, the International Organization of Migration, UNICEF doing fantastic work with children, UNFPA trying to get the family planning supplies through. All of these are important. The big NGOs like Oxfam New Zealand, I know, has been appealing for the Rohingya people in the Cox's Bazar camp. It's going to take cash at scale to support refugee communities through this COVID-19 crisis. And I hope, you know, as we dig deep here in New Zealand, as we must to support our people who are thrown out of work and support livelihoods here, there are also these other extremely vulnerable fellow citizens around our world who are suffering.
Yeah, I think one of the, probably the main lesson we've learned here in New Zealand from the COVID crisis has been that unless all of us are okay, we can't ever really beat this virus. And actually, we do have to think of it in a global way. So, you know, if we do continue to have these enormous outbreaks in migrant and refugee communities and other vulnerable communities. And we've seen in Singapore, even though their response was really successful, that they didn't take care of their migrant worker communities and had more and more outbreaks. So on a global scale, that's what we're facing, and we actually need to, as sort of humanity, find solutions to this that work for everyone. So our aid program has moved a lot in the past years to sort of a trade for aid model and direct aid models that kind of focus on diplomacy. And actually we can't really, and I agree, we can't really ignore the kind of big multilateral aid agencies that we contribute to as well, and we can't kind of pull our aid out of that system that is the World Health Organization, for example, and kind of focus that aid in a way that only will necessarily benefit us as a bilateral kind of relationship. So there are issues there that we need to rethink as we've reset our aid model now that COVID is at hand. But I think the other thing that I'd really like us to do, and maybe this isn't directly related to refugees, but it is related to some of the causes of the problem, is that we do need to look at relief for developing world debt. It's kind of time to actually look at why inequality exists on such a massive scale in our globe, and where debt comes into it. And we've heard from the experts that is the next step. So.
I think debt's going to be a very big issue for every country post-COVID. So I want to move closer to home now, still a little bit on the international scene, but a bit closer. And Golriz, this is particularly geared to you. So in November, you welcomed Buruz Bachani to New Zealand. And recently he's been granted refugee status. This is wonderful for him. But sadly, there are many detainees still in Papua New Guinea and Nauru who are in dreadful conditions. Is New Zealand's current response enough? And/or what should we be doing?
Yeah, so that was a very special moment for me and the 3 or 4 others who were kind of through Amnesty and whoever else who knew about Buruz arriving and who got to go and welcome him. And for me in particular, because my family had walked through that exact gateway into New Zealand and got in to claim asylum, gone through a legal process, that we have here. And Buruz and I are around the same age, and he's Kurdish, and he, hadn't had that opportunity. He'd grown up under that incredibly repressive regime, become a student activist, become a journalist. That made his life there absolutely untenable. We know what that regime is like. But he had the misfortune of aiming to go to Australia to access his fundamental right to claim asylum and be free from torture. And that meant that he was diverted to effectively a torture island. And we know the United Nations and the likes of Amnesty International have described the conditions on Manus Island and Nauru as amounting to torture. So, 6 or 7 years there, and an award-winning book later, he got to come here to attend a book festival and a writers festival and then eventually got processed. Now that shouldn't be, that should not be the process by which you escape torture. Australia is trying to deter people who are already escaping the absolute unthinkable. Tamils from northern Sri Lanka, or Iraqis, Iranians escaping war and persecution. They're trying to deter them. So they've created conditions that are that bad. And, it does start to amount to an international crime. And it's in our Pacific neighborhood. So New Zealand, and I was really relieved to have our Prime Minister really early on in this term renew the offer to take some of the asylum seekers and refugees still on Nauru from Australia, and they've obviously declined. But I think it is time, as good international citizens, that we do look at other options, and those options are that we approach Nauru and PNG directly. We know that, in terms of PNG, the Manus Island prison camp was ruled unconstitutional by their highest court, and it's been dismantled, so people are just floundering there on a military base effectively. But we can talk to those nations directly, and I think we can provide some relief for the refugees and asylum seekers left there.
Helen, you were famous in a way for welcoming the Tampa boys to New Zealand. I know these situations are different, but what's your view on New Zealand's response and or what might be possible in Papua New Guinea and Nauru?
Well, first on the Tampa boys, what incredible citizens in New Zealand they've become.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was pleased to welcome them personally at the Mangere refugee camp, and then over the years to keep in touch with a number and see their families do well. I mean, it's just, it's a wonderful story. And I remember when word first started to seep out on the news that New Zealand was considering being part of the solution to the Tampa crisis. The shock jock radio, etc., got into the act and started running snap polls saying, should, quote, these people come here? And I remember one of them got about 89% no. And I put my hard hat on and went out with a press conference and said, look, let's get real here. Here's the reasons people are fleeing Afghanistan, fleeing from the Taliban, fleeing from decades of civil war and poverty and the rest of it. Let's have a heart here. And over time, it was incredible and really heartening to see the New Zealand population come around to see that these were human beings, just like us, in an intolerable situation. And with respect to the boys, their families had, pawned everything they had to get those boys out of hell, basically, and to get a foothold somewhere else. So I think it was a really good opportunity to educate the public about the background to the issues. Of course, we had the people who moaned that they were queue jumpers and all the rest of it. Well, I'd jump a queue to have got out of Taliban-ruled Afghanistan as well, quite frankly. I mean, put ourselves in these situations. People do what they believe is right for their families. So, New Zealand was able to be part of the solution then. And look, John Howard agreed to us being part of the solution. We offered, they accepted. Now, what has changed is that both with Jacinda Ardern and with John Key, they have offered to be part of the solution. And the current Australian government has not accepted that offer. And that's most unfortunate because we could help. And I'm so pleased that Beirut has been able to come here, miracle really, to get a visitor visa to come to a writers' festival and then actually be offered a safe haven after all this time by our country. We can help, but the door has to be open to New Zealand help.
Do we need New Zealand? Do we need Australians' approval?
Look, probably technically not, but ideally, you would have an agreement that it had their support, because otherwise it becomes a very aggravating issue in the relationship. So I think we should continue to offer and call on the good offices of the UN High Commission for Refugees and International Organization of Migration to help us get the offer materializing.
Mm. It's very political.
Very.
Mm. So I just want to come to New Zealand's settlement program now. So we're regarded around the world as having a world-class resettlement centre and process. But our refugee quota is only 1,500, recently increased from 1,000. This is just a drop in the bucket. Surely New Zealand could be doing more.
Well, look, of course, it's a drop in the bucket when you look at 1/3 of the 79.5 million forcibly displaced people who are refugees. But I think, as I said at the very beginning of the session, actually refugee resettlement isn't going to solve the crisis. For some people fortunate enough to be among last year's 107,000 resettled globally, yes, fantastic. But for most people, it's not the way forward. So I think New Zealand needs to continue to do its bit to the extent that it can do a decent job of resettlement. And that means, not only capacity, obviously, at the official reception centre, but also the agencies that support resettlement, the communities that support resettlement. I did do a quick bit of research before coming on screen to see what other small like-minded democracies were doing. I found Norway last year accepted only 1,200. Now, I was quite surprised by that because I thought the Norwegians would be accepting vastly more than we do. Actually, no. Finland last year accepted 850. The year before only 750. So we don't seem to be completely out of the ballpark for the numbers that we are taking. I think, you know, the most effective thing New Zealand should be doing on refugees is raising its voice on the forced displacement. And, you know, often our diplomacy is a bit timid, I think, in calling out what is happening, which is, you know, driving people to leave their homes. I'm waiting in vain, by the way, for the statement to come out on Belarus. You know, there are people having to flee Belarus with the terrible repression, detentions, torture of people who stood up and, you know, supported the opposition in the last election. Now, you know, what has New Zealand got to lose for standing on its principles here? So I'd like to see some more vocal diplomacy.
What about you, Golriz? What's your reflection on our resettlement program?
Well, it's vastly under capacity in our view. It's, you know, per capita, we take far fewer refugees in our quota than Australia. So yeah, we don't torture asylum seekers on prison islands, but we also don't really resettle nearly as many refugees per capita than Australia does, and Canada then is vastly higher levels even than that. So if, you know, if we look at some other like-minded nations, we are doing quite poorly. Our green policy is to raise the refugee quota to 4,000 over 6 years so that the resource is able to be made available over that time, and to make the community placement model, which is, I think, our aim, but I'm not sure what the aim of the actual organisations leading it are. Our aim is 1,000 per year in community placement. So that's the resource that that's been provided by, you know, pre-approved community placement organisations, and we do need to resource them to some extent. And I think in the report that came out of that initial trial period, even though that has been extended, was that they actually would like some support from the government, whether that's just coordination or whatever else, but we can actually resettle quite a few more people, and that's, you know, that's 1,000 more lives over time if we actually make sure that our communities who are out there who actually want to support refugees are able to do it. So there is a lot more we can do, and we have just now also doubled the number of families that can be reunified per year with their refugee family members here, which was a Green Confidence and Supply Agreement win, and that's been resourced. So there's a lot of different ways that we can support these communities, and I think prevention is absolutely the best way, because refugees, you know, that's the definition, is this is someone who doesn't want to leave, who's had to leave. No one wants to leave their home because of a war or because of a repressive government or because of persecution based on their religion. So we do need to work on that. But while the crisis is happening and people are in desperate need, we also need to provide for that emergency sort of relief by way of resettlement and by way of supporting the organisations on the ground too. So we can't just do prevention, that takes time.
So, Golriz, I'd like to acknowledge that the Labor government have increased the number of people who can come under family reunification, and they're extending the community sponsorship program. But these groups, along with convention refugees, receive very different support than the quota. This is inequitable, and it places an incredible burden on refugee communities. So how can we ensure a much more equitable resettlement program in New Zealand so that all the different categories are cared for?
I would just say, because this is very close to my heart, so I worked on it for most of this term, the family reunification model is for the first time ever going to be funded. So it has just in the past budget that we just, you know, did just under COVID. And I'm so proud that we did get this through, and in those circumstances that New Zealand wasn't just so inward looking that we scrapped that part of our confidence and supply win. You know, we got $21 million over 3 years to fund the 300 extra people And that means a lot to those families. That's probably going to be enough to, you know, if you divide the cost by the cost of getting people here, which refugee families were having to bear themselves. So a refugee alone here with no immediate family was having to wait years because they were raising the money to get the kids and the spouse in some cases out of a really precarious situation, but you needed to pay for it, you know, private immigration lawyer, the visas, the airfares, and it meant families were separated for years at a time in really stressful circumstances. And that in itself, being taken care of, is going to mean a lot. But it will also mean that there'll be some support on the ground. Now, the fact that people hadn't had any support on the ground as they arrive is extraordinary to me. And we know that that's the case also for asylum seekers, that we in our system do sort of draw this vast distinction between quota refugees and convention, so-called convention refugees, who are, you know, people who arrive and claim asylum at the border. It's perfectly lawful. There's no distinction in international law or in our law, but in practice, one group gets all of this resettlement support and the other doesn't. So my focus now will be on helping us get to a place where we support asylum seekers as well while they wait for their claim to be processed.
That will make a lot of people very happy to hear that. I'm looking at the time and I think we should possibly just move on. So we're in the midst of a global pandemic and New Zealand's borders are closed. The refugee quota program is on hold. Do you think there is a case for the quota to be reopened on humanitarian grounds?
Well, yes. You know, I mean, one of the problems in the COVID response, and I've commented on it elsewhere, is we have a choke point with the numbers we can provide for in quarantine. But it wouldn't, you know, take a genius to work out how to deal with the choke point. And in dealing with it, you could plan to have, you know, groups manageable in size who are coming under the quota come. Now, I can immediately, you know, hear the sort of shock jock comments that'll come to that, saying, my daughter couldn't get on the plane from Sydney because they were told there wasn't enough room. But, you know, we will have to scale up our quarantine arrangements, and as and when we do, which may be post-election because everything is politics now, I would hope that we would be humane enough to make provision in the scaled up quarantine for people who have been accepted as quota refugees but are still languishing in refugee camps at the moment. That would be my hope.
And you, Golriz?
Well, in the interest of time, I agree. Yeah, we absolutely need to start asking those logistical questions and then prioritising those who've been accepted and, as you say, languishing. So, yeah.
So moving on, I want to just briefly talk about immigration. It's a highly politicised issue, and we've heard Trump's cry to ban Muslims. New Zealand leaders have already jumped on the bandwagon talking about queue jumpers. And refugees are so often blamed for a country's woes. In a recent survey we did, we found that the main reason people didn't want refugees here was because of housing crisis. How do we begin to change this narrative?
Well, obviously refugees didn't cause the housing crisis. You know, the reality is that New Zealand had the largest population growth of any developed country in the period of the last government. We developed an economic model which was, you know, volume over value for just about everything. And when we scaled up to 4 million tourists a year, we didn't have the workforce to staff the hotels, so we give more work permits, and, you know, sort of a whole cascading effect of you know, significant numbers of temporary entrants, and people who've got to live somewhere as well. You could have people buy New Zealand residential housing off the plans from anywhere in the world. That led to speculation. I think at the last census, we had somewhere close to 40,000 officially empty houses in Auckland, where people had purchased them but didn't live in them. And that would probably be an understatement. So, you know, all these reasons were behind the housing crisis. Now, the government's moved on that in a number of ways, obviously, and stopping the sale of residential housing to people who aren't resident here was a good first step. But really, no one can seriously use the housing issue as an excuse for not accepting our responsibilities for quota refugees. I also find it interesting that the housing issue, which was seen to be so intractable, when COVID came along, we found a way to house the homeless. I hope they haven't been pushed out in the streets again, because we can house the homeless, right? through many means, through expanded state housing, expanded community partnerships, supporting great initiatives like Auckland City Missions Housing First initiative, which with the new accommodation is looking not just to provide, you know, soup and solace through the day to Auckland's inner city homeless, but actually a place to be in order to rehabilitate and come back into the mainstream of society. So, you know, we've got a lot of fundamental issues to address here. And as we address them, let's also remember our international obligations to support the High Commission for Refugees and the refugees it's trying to resettle.
Yeah, I think that's kind of that. In a way, it's just the complexity of talking about something like the housing crisis, and I would add to that things like we don't have a fair, you know, tax system on capital. We sold off the state houses. You know, there's just so many aspects to it. We don't have rent control. You know, that bubble is created by so many different components of terrible policy that have been put in place by, you know, I can say successive governments, but it's harder to explain that. It's harder to present those solutions. It's much easier, and we've seen this throughout history elsewhere in the world as well, to scapegoat groups that are different and foreign. And people don't quite understand what refugees are. What does that mean? And so I think we can shift the prejudice by telling a different story, and it is all about storytelling. You know, our stories right now are all, you know, connected to images of terrorism, to war, to famine. There's this, and politicians and shock jocks and whoever else have been really willing to exploit that to rile up fear. And I think New Zealand, and we probably need to acknowledge, you know, we're only sort of 18 months out from the biggest acts of terror, hate crime that's happened in our nation's sort of living memory, which was the Christchurch terror attack, which did affect refugees and migrant communities. It's those stories that haven't been told that leave us really, really vulnerable, and vulnerable to exploitation by whoever kind of would exploit us for their own gain. So we need to be able to tell our own stories as well. It's that pass the mic thing. You know, we need to be more on the screen. We need to be more involved in journalism. We need to be more involved in governance and leadership, and we need to be able to shape those stories ourselves. Because yeah, we have escaped terrorism and repression and war and fundamentalism, but we have birthday parties, and we're student activists, and we're journalists like Golriz was, and we're feminists. But we haven't had that space, and I think New Zealand that needs, now that we've recommitted after Christchurch to kind of that inclusion, we need to start making those spaces in our systems, whether it's broadcasting or politics or whatever else, to get the voices up. And I think New Zealand will see the benefits of having an inclusive society much more clearly then.
It's a nice segue into my next question, Golriz. And I've taken these ideas from your recent book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I really recommend it, everybody. Know Your Place. You've graphically described the impact of hate speech on you. I mean, you talked about being the voice for refugees, but you've called for the regulation of hate speech. I want to discuss the idea, is this enough? And what about people's right to freedom of speech? So it's all very well to put the case for more refugees, for a humanitarian quota, but how do you cope with that horrendous backlash, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, freedom of speech is one of our most, you know, fundamental rights, and it underpins so many of our other rights, our democracy. So it has to be absolutely protected. But hate speech is the thing that really undermines many of our rights as well, but in particular also freedom of speech. It silences people, it silences entire communities. And our definition of hate speech needs to be such that it's set at such a high level that we do kind of define it as harmful speech. We're not talking about sort of offence, we're not talking about anything subjective, but we do need to recognise that we're part of a global community now where we are consuming, you know, really fundamentalist, extremist, dangerous speech, and that there's particular communities that are really vulnerable to it, and that it does result, it has historically resulted, and I've, you know, talked about this to many different sort of communities, including the Holocaust Centre, and, you know, it has historically resulted in harm that's gone much further than just silencing people and excluding them from community life. It has resulted in violence. So we need to have those conversations. And it's, I mean, I was shocked at the volume of the kind of really abusive sort of backlash that I would get, and the fact that it snowballed into things like death threats. But I don't think any of us in those kind of communities where you have a refugee background, a Middle Eastern background, or even an Asian, New Zealand, you know, those backgrounds, that we're not surprised that the prejudice exists. But we kind of do now know, we're on notice that it can lead to something far worse than that, and it can be a danger to all of our societies. The one thing about our hate speech laws that I think does need to be, and the Minister does agree with me, and he's obviously initiated the review, that we need to look at, is that we don't really cover all groups, we only cover race groups. So there's that, you know, we can make it more inclusive. It's about covering religious minorities, covering gender minorities, the rainbow community, the disabilities community, and actually making sure that there's recourse. We know the Islamic Women's Council was reporting hate crimes and hate speech for 5 years. They were traveling around the country, meeting with police, talking to them about what this rise meant for their communities. They were living in fear. And I'm really aware that not everyone has the privilege that I have, you know, the security that I have. They're walking their kids to school, their you know, grandparents are walking to mosque or whatever. They are actually really fearful. And that's not the New Zealand that I recognise, that the New Zealand that welcomed me. So we do need recourse. We're not talking about sending people to prison for speech, but we're talking about having a way of actually making sure that harm, if it's coming, you know, we're on top of it and we can protect our communities.
Have you got any more thoughts on that topic, Helen?
Yes, well, I mean, I'm very disturbed by the amount of hate speech that is now flowing off New Zealanders' smartphones and laptops into social media. Sadly, I think there is influence from populist, racist, etc. movements offshore, and it finds an audience here, and it's deeply unpleasant. You know, to look at some of what passes for comment from our fellow citizens on social media, you just feel ashamed, really, and embarrassed. Now, I totally agree with Golriz. Fantastic if the hate speech law can be updated, because clearly it needs to cover gender minorities, LGBTQI, disability. Sometimes I think maybe it should be covering women as well, because women, and not least women politicians, come in for a tremendous amount of hate speech. Just do a search on Golriz or Jacinda or Helen or whatever on Twitter, and you'll see it all there. Very deeply unpleasant and nasty people who should be reported. I also think we need to look at the issue of social media regulation standards, and it needs to be what I guess the term now is bespoke regulation. Look, the things that are allowed to sit on social media would not be allowed to exist for 1 minute on mainstream television. They wouldn't be allowed to exist in mainstream media. We have statutory regulation for the broadcasting media, and we have the Media Council regulating print media, which does a reasonable job, in my opinion. Nothing really for social media. And so my foundation published on this last year, and we suggested that you need a statutory duty on the social media companies to have a policy on this, which they will enforce, and you put a regulator above that to look at whether they're upholding the standards. But we can't just continue in this free-for-all, because it's driving division and polarization in our society. And heaven forbid we get to the level that it is in the United States or some other countries. That's not us. As Golriz said, this is not the country she was welcomed into. It's not the country you and I were born into, Anne. I don't like it. And I think we need more voices for tolerance, for courtesy, respectful discourse, tolerating not only difference in many ways, but differences of opinion. People have become very, very intolerant, and there's an end to that, which isn't very nice and not what we want for our country.
Well, so much to do, and there are so many questions in our Q&A, and we promised to get to them, so I think we might have to just whisk over that way, and I will do my best to get through some of them at least. I want to go right back to the very first question I asked about how we cope with basically what's called the refugee crisis. There are a couple of comments here that I'll try and combine. One is about the fact that peace is not, we've always had conflict in our society, and world peace isn't going to solve the refugee problem. What else can we do to tackle displacement? And another comment here around the fact that civil society has been asked to come up with a fourth sustainable solution through the UNHCR. Do you have any response to this idea and ideas of what a fourth sustainable solution could be?
Well, let me comment on the first one, because I agree with the question that world peace isn't about to break out. There's major powers and regional powers standing behind a range of these conflicts, and until they come to their senses, sadly, Yemenis, Syrians, many others are going to just be collateral damage, human collateral damage in these awful conflicts. But most refugees actually stay pretty close to the country they left. You think of the main distribution, for example, of Syrian refugees: Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. So what is desperately needed is support for those countries. Those countries were on their knees, Jordan and Lebanon, economically before COVID. It'll be worse now. And they really struggle in this situation. So support for refugees where they are is extremely important. It's also true that a lot of the forcibly displaced are internally displaced, and they don't get the same level of support that people who are formally assessed as refugees over a border actually get. And obviously the numbers of internally displaced in Syria are very, very high, but it hasn't often been the easiest cause to rally money for, to support Syrians who've been displaced in their own country. I'll give you another example. In 2016, I went to the far north of Cameroon, where Boko Haram had caused havoc, because it was in that four-state area of Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. And what I saw there were refugee camps where people had come over the border from Nigeria, and they had all the services. UNHCR was there, UNICEF, everybody, services. And then you go down the road, and here's little communities of 200-300 people in temporary camps who were from within Cameroon, close to the border, and had to flee, but no one was there to give them any service at all. So that's where International Organization of Migration and other agencies can help. And I just say to New Zealand aid decision makers, have a look at these circumstances that go beyond the formal refugees in camps across a border to the forcibly displaced within a country, who often get much less attention.
Thanks.
Yeah. I would just say, world peace is elusive, it turns out. It is something we need to focus on in terms of how we contribute to conflict, because we haven't dispensed with things like investing in war industries, and we need to look at our own banking sector, and we need to look at what we buy. And I've kind of covered that earlier, and we do need to look at where New Zealand can sit in terms of peace mediation. We're really well placed if we kind of make ourselves the independent voice that we have been in the past. I would look at our allegiances with the likes of Trump, kind of undermining some of that in some ways. But I do think we need to invest in helping people who need it right now as well, because it's kind of, it isn't quite good enough to tell them to wait until we've solved world conflict. I would say we need to support refugees where they are but only if that means that they do have a pathway to residency where they are. Because I do worry that if we're just supporting people to generationally stay in camps, that isn't quite in the spirit of the Refugee Convention and the rights of refugees and displaced persons to kind of live a full life and become citizens. So, you know, resettlement may not be a reality in terms of bringing everyone to Australia and New Zealand, but that may be something that we do need to look at far more closely, and we do need to do a lot more. But if we're going to invest in helping people where they are, we also need to mediate pathways for them to settle where they are in a meaningful way.
Here's one that's sort of related around New Zealand's refugee policy. Where do you see the balance between New Zealand determining policy response compared to the policy being determined by large neighbours and other members of the Five Eyes?
I don't think the Five Eyes is relevant to it at all. I mean, I've commented on another medium, Guy and Espina's podcast, that I'm actually a little concerned at the Five Eyes creep that went on from 2009. But, you know, New Zealand must design its own policies on these issues and strive to be in line with its international obligations as a signatory to the Refugee Convention. I really don't think this is any business of Five Eyes at all.
I agree, and I would like us to pull out of the Five Eyes. So just add that. So I do think we're breaking international law in a lot of ways, and the allegiances that we are, you know, just sort of that's connecting us to that are becoming tenuous in terms of New Zealand's values.
Okay, changing direction completely. I like this question. If quota refugees are recognised as New Zealand residents before they arrive in New Zealand, why are we not bringing them over like we would do other residents to protect them?
Not quite sure what that question means.
Well, when people are recognised by UNHCR as refugees and have been accepted by Immigration New Zealand to come here under the quota program, they have residency. So they are New Zealand residents. Why aren't they allowed to come now?
Well, maybe Golriz has a more up-to-date answer, but whether they actually have to be here to establish that would be the issue. They're entitled to come with residence, yes, but it's not like they're returning permanent residents. There's probably a distinction being made between returning permanent resident and permanent resident once arrived. But I think the question's answered by what we said earlier, which is that New Zealand has agreed to take an annual quota and that it could actually get on with doing that. There was a very interesting comment that I responded to on the Q&A from the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre, where Marie Franklin said it's almost empty at the moment. We quarantined the last group of refugees who came in, so why can't we do that again? Well, very good question. I mean, why can't we be bringing the quota refugees through Mangere refugee camp, using that as the quarantine facility and letting people go out to their, you know, community sponsors and others from there? I just don't get it.
I have an answer from one of the members of the audience. Fiona Jackson says residency is not activated until they arrive in New Zealand for the first time.
That's correct. But that, I mean, in a sense, it's immaterial, because they could be coming to the Mangere Resettlement Centre, be quarantined there, and then go out into their new lives in the community as per normal.
That's exactly right. So it's a really good point, and it's something that just needs to be implemented. So we do have the facility that a group of people who would have likely been tested because they go through health checks before they even arrive. But in any case, we have the facility to quarantine them for 6 weeks, and it's all set up. So we do need to do it. And I was really heartened to get agreement to exclude them from the payment, the quarantine payment. That would have been absolutely absurd. So we're sort of ready, and we just need to, I think, in the next tranche of our COVID response, just begin to go back to implementing our refugee quota as normal, but with quarantine in place, which is probably going to be the easiest new quarantine facility to start using.
By the way, an obvious point to make, and we have a very interested audience on these issues, at some point when this level 3 lockdown's over, people get back to holding public meetings or online forums, whatever, ask these questions. Ask candidates what they're going to do about it. You know, what's their party policy? If there's not a policy, what will they personally do? You know, we get this opportunity every 3 years to ask questions of people who want to represent us in Parliament. My plea is use it.
We've had a couple of questions around asylum seekers being put into Mount Eden Correctional Facility. So on the one hand, somebody comments, well, while we don't torture people offshore, we do put them into Mount Eden, or a very small number. And while it is a small number, how can we justify this? And there's been a lot being said recently about the need to stop this practice. Have you got comments on that?
Well, there would be very few circumstances in which it would be warranted. I mean, it used to be by and large the case that asylum seekers would be processed, given a work permit, and would wait for the determination to work through. So, you know, I can see very few grounds apart from the issuing of a security risk certificate, and there's only been one of those in the last 20 years to the best of my knowledge, where the detention would be warranted. You know, really, the system has to be smarter than that.
Yeah, no, I can give a little bit of detail to that. That was something that I was a little bit involved in my previous life as a lawyer, and looked into. It is a practice that is happening based on security risk, but not within that legislative framework. So it's in my opinion and others, unlawful. But it's a practice that's happening by INZ, and in some cases, really alarmingly, they're perceiving a security risk based solely, it seems, because they haven't been able to provide any other information on the asylum seeker not having correct travel documents, which, you know, specifically they're not allowed to sanction someone for, and you know, asylum seekers for very good reason are recognised as people who may not be able to get travel documents to escape what they're escaping.
Exactly.
And they have other means of showing who they are, and you know, you investigate, and that asylum process is aimed at doing that. You know, they have other documents, they have photos, they have witness evidence quite often. So you can't imprison someone in a maximum security prison based on the lack of travel documents, but it is happening. And it is something that we need to challenge. There's been one or two cases where there's been sort of, you know, the criminal convictions elsewhere in the world, and so they've been held on more, you know, valid security risk issues. But by and large, it's a practice that we need to absolutely stop.
Yeah, well, it sounds, Golriz, like there's been quite a lot of creep, because, as you say, if they're going to use those grounds, they need to, you know, produce a security risk certificate, which they're not doing, and I think it's highly challenging.
It's a problem in our legal system as well, because they turn up to the district courts and the duty lawyers deal with them. Duty lawyers are criminal lawyers, so they don't know that immigration framework, and their detention just rolls over every time. Yeah, you know, before they have access to a refugee lawyer, and then there's this gap in the system, and it's both in legal assistance and in immigration officials actually knowing what their obligations and duties are.
Very sadly, I think we're out of time, but there are so many more really, really fantastic questions in the Q&A. I'm so sorry to those of you who've put them forward and we've not been able to get to them. But I have a sense that both Golriz and Helen are committed to this cause and will continue to ensure that good processes are put forward. So to Helen and Golriz, thank you both so much. Thank you for your support of RAS. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Your knowledge and experience on both the global and New Zealand situations have given us all a huge amount to think about. And a very big thank you to the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all the questions. I'd just like to let you know about our next forum, which is tomorrow, Wednesday at midday. The RAS New Zealand clinical team are going to be presenting on mental health issues. So I hope you'll be able to join us then. Again, thank you, Golriz. Thank you, Helen. It's been wonderful chatting to you. Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks so much.